All right, everybody, Mr. J here from Organized Biology. If you've gotten to this point in your anatomy class, you're likely in for a rude awakening because tissues can be quite complex. And in fact, when I first started learning about anatomy and physiology, this was my least favorite topic. But now that I've learned it, I see the benefit of learning about all these four tissue types now so that later when you see them, you'll be able to connect it back to this video. So go ahead, buckle up, let's rock and roll. So tissues, this is a level of organization just above the cellular level. So in tissues, we're looking at clusters, okay, so many, of similarly shaped or similarly functioning cells. I'm just going to say similarly functioning cells. Key letter there is the extra S. So we're talking about many cells working together for a common function. Now you may hear of tissues being the prefix of histo, and that is absolutely true. So we're studying histology. Okay, not history, histology. Histology is much more important for A&P. But speaking of a little bit of history, the reason we classified tissues is because as the anatomists were looking at the 30 trillion cells of the body, we need to be able to group them properly by shape as well as by function. So they came up with 4 different classifications: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous, and each of them have similar components within the cells themselves. So we're going to start with epithelial, hop to muscular and nervous, and then come back to this mosh posh of connective tissue, all right? So buckle up, let's get rolling. Epithelial tissue. Let's look at the word first. Epithelia, I believe that is Greek for upon and sheet-like, sheet-like. So it's a sheet-like structure upon some other structure. So just think of this as the coverings or the linings of your body, both externally as well as internally. In fact, I like to think of epithelial tissue as if you take your finger and literally shove it wherever you want on your body, you're likely touching epithelial tissue. It's covering you, okay? Kind of a weird way to think about it. But in epithelial tissue, we classify it based on 2 things. The first thing is going to be, as you see on the screen, shape. You look at all these different shapes of cells. We've got squamous cells. So squamous kind of sounds like squashed. You've got that squaw, right? Wasn't that a thing at one point? Squaw! Anyway, squamous cells, they're very flat and thin. Then we've got these cube-shaped cells we called cuboidal cells. Then we've got these taller, thicker cells called columnar cells. And then I'm going to go back to this one here in a second, but look at the shapes, right? They're all different. But you can also classify epithelial tissue based on its layering, okay? It's layering. So with layering, if it is considered simple, it just has 1 layer of cells. So for a simple squamous connective tissue, you'd literally see all of these cells just in a line like that. That would be simple squamous epithelial tissue. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes we have stratified cells. Strata, like stratigraphy in geology, means the layerings of the earth. So strata means layer, so it means it's layered cells. So if it's stratified, it's going to have 2 or more cells stacked on top of it. As I've drawn in this little diagram, we've got many flattened squamous cells together. These are stratified squamous or squamous cells. This is actually in your skin, the epidermis of your skin. Okay, so we know we can go by shape and layer. So we could also have stratified cuboidal, simple cuboidal, so forth and so on. Then we get to this weird one. This is a strange one. This is called pseudostratified. Pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. So this one's weird because it is pseudo or false stratified. So when you look at it microscopically, a lot of the times you look at it and it looks like there's many layers of the columns, but actually it's just because there's such a thin base, it just looks stratified even though it is 1 layer. So it's the false layered columnar. Now the way you can actually differentiate this guy is it's got little projections here called cilia. And their little projections are actually going to kind of beat one direction. So let's get into some of the functions of these guys because that'll help us explain some of the structures. So let's talk first about the squamous cells. If it's simple, most of the time this is for diffusion. So in your respiratory tract, when you breathe in oxygen, for example, into your lungs, the oxygen goes to these simple squamous cells, and it's butted up right against the bloodstream so that oxygen can get from outside air into the bloodstream really easily. So the cells are almost just like a placeholder to allow those things to pass through. Whereas when they're stratified squamous, it's usually for protection, like in your skin. You don't want to get things inside of your skin, so you have stratified squamous cells. Wonderful. For cuboidal and columnar, and even for the pseudostratified columnar, all three of these guys will be involved with some sort of secretion. So I'm going to say secretion, and that's a fancy way of just saying spewing a product out of themselves. So these cells will have some sort of product they'll put into their little vesicles, little transport organelles inside of themselves, and they will spew them out of themselves and release that product. Now that product can either go into the bloodstream or it can go just out of the body in general, and that would be either an endocrine gland or an exocrine gland. So the cubes and the columns consist of your glands. For example, you've got cuboidal cells that will produce sweat in your sweat glands. They will also produce saliva in your salivary glands. They'll also produce tears in your lacrimal glands. So these are just types of products that these cells can make. They're a type of gland. Now, question for you. Why would these, like cuboidal cells, be better at producing a product than the squamous cells? Why would these be better than that? Well, if you look at just the amount of space inside of them, the cells just have a lot more space to work with inside of themselves to make the product. The squamous cells, they really don't have much room at all. They're so thin and flat, like a pancake. It would be like cooking in a kitchen that's this wide versus a kitchen that is very big, like has an island in the middle and all that jazz if you watch, like Chip and Joanna. So I always think of the cuboidal, columnar cells and pseudostratified, they're producing a product. Now, specifically for the columnar cells and then the pseudostratified, the columnar cells themselves are going to be found lining the intestinal tract, the gastrointestinal tract, oops, I can't spell while talking, intestinal tract. Now, why is this still epithelial tissue? Because if I stick my finger into my mouth and stick it all the way down to my intestines, I'm still touching the linings of my body. But in this case, these cells are going to act as absorptive cells. Absorptive cells. That means they're drawing some things, the nutrients that you ate, across themselves into the blood so that it can go everywhere. Brilliant. Now the pseudostratified, we have those cilia on the outside, right? And they're moving and moving and beating and beating. Why are they doing that? Well, these line your respiratory tract. So these line your respiratory tract. Because have you ever gone outside, say right now, like in March or April, and those trees are starting to blossom and spew pollen everywhere, and you start getting kind of congested, right? You start coughing a little more. You start getting really just stuffy. Why is that? Well, because these cells are producing a product called mucus, and the mucus traps all of these allergens, brings them up your respiratory tract with the cilia, so the cilia move it up, and then it gets to a point where you can cough it out or then like sneeze it out or other gross things, right? So all of these line tracts, and they're mainly for protection, secretion, and diffusion. Diffusion just in the case of the simple squamous. Awesome. Oh, one more thing about epithelial tissue. This is an interesting one. Of the cancers that are commonly occurring in the body, 80 to 90% of cancers are actually cancers of the epithelial tract. Okay, so any epithelial tissue, 80 to 90% of the cancers are from epithelial tissue. Why is that? Why is that? Well, in previous videos, I've talked about cell biology and how there are certain cells that rapidly divide and grow a lot. Those are epithelial cells. So these guys, we say, are highly mitotic. Highly mitotic. Fancy way of saying they divide a lot. They regenerate a lot. Think about it. Your skin replaces itself every about month to a month and a half. So all these cells that you see will be dead in a month and a half, and you have to regenerate them. Same thing with the tract of your digestive system. These have to constantly rebuild themselves. How do they do that? Through mitosis. And anytime a cell divides a lot, it has a risk of dividing way too rapidly and uncontrollably because of mutations, and that is called cancer. So interesting point about epithelial tissue there. So let's hop over to the muscular tissue. Now, muscular tissue, relatively straightforward and simple. Muscular tissue is able to contract to generate force. Contract to generate force. So these are cells that are able to shorten and actually move something, essentially, generate a force. So you get three types, and I'm going to classify them by how they look, as well as if you can control them or not. So let's start first and see if you can predict. With skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, you can predict that skeletal muscle tissue is connected, quite literally, to your skeleton. So these are your skeletal muscles, like your biceps, your triceps, your pectoralis major and minor. These guys are striped. Do you see these lines here? So these are considered striated. Striated just means striped, okay? And the reason for that is because, as you can imagine, think of this as like an accordion cell. And as the cell shortens, contracts, what will the lines do? Well, they're going to come closer together. And that's actually how your muscles contract. It's like an accordion coming closer together. And then as you extend them, they can spread further apart. So striated muscle just contracts kind of like that accordion. Now with that, can you control these skeletal muscles? Can you tell these muscles when to contract? Well, obviously, I'm doing it right now, right? So these are considered voluntary. There are neurons originating in your brain that can talk to these guys, tell them when to contract, and they're voluntary for that reason. Beautiful. You'll also notice that there are many dark dots inside of skeletal muscles. These are nuclei. Nuclei. Plural for nucleus. So these are one of the few cells that actually have multiple nucleuses within them. That's important because they're going to make a lot of proteins. Okay, so you need a lot of nuclei, a lot of instructions to make a lot of proteins. Brilliant. The next ones are kind of more spiral shaped, and these are called cardiac muscles. Cardiac muscle tissue. Specifically, we could say cardiac myocytes, just to show you that words matter. Myocytes, heart muscle cell. Brilliant. So heart muscle cells, let's think about it. Are they striated? Do you see lines in them? Absolutely. So these are striated. That means that they contract in the same manner, accordion style, as the skeletal muscle. So it's nice is when you learn it in this A&P1 class, you learn how these contract. It's the same exact way these guys contract for the most part. Pretty cool. The second thing, can you control your heart muscle? Are you telling your heart muscle when to contract or not? If you are, we need to study your body and figure out how that's working. But no, these are involuntary muscles. And think about it. You don't want to have control over your heart. Could you imagine every second having to think, oh yeah, beat, beat, beat? No, I would forget. I lose my memory way too easily. So these are involuntary muscle fibers you can't control. They're actually controlled by something called a pacemaker cell in your SA node. Now what I want to point out with these guys is there's an extra structure here. They have connections between the cells. So like this is like muscle cell number 1 right here. Here's muscle cell number 2 and muscle cell number 3. And you see these connectors. You see these connectors here? These guys are called gap junctions. Gap junctions. And what that allows is an electrical current actually to flow from one cell to the next very, very easily. That allows the entire heart as a muscle to contract together in a moment. And that's how you want your heart muscle to contract. So we'll learn more about that later on in A&P2. You'll also see there are just single nuclei in each muscle cell. So each one just has one nucleus, as opposed to the skeletal, which has many. Last one, I'm not going to talk about too much. These are called smooth muscles. Can you guess why they are called smooth muscles? Because they look relatively smooth, right? And smooth muscles are found in a variety of places. These two are pretty obvious, right? Like heart and skeletal muscles. But the smooth muscles are found wrapped around your arteries, like your big blood vessels. They're wrapped around your intestines. There are some smooth muscles in your skin, interestingly enough, we'll learn about, in your eye, etc. Okay, specifically the iris of your eye, not the eye muscles that actually allow it to move. That's actually a skeletal muscle. Now, smooth muscle, let's think about it. Is it striated? Does it have stripes? No, that's why it's called smooth. So we say it's not striated, it is smooth. And can you control when your arteries, intestines, skin contract? No, you don't. Obviously, so this is involuntary. It's primarily controlled by your autonomic nervous system, your automatic nervous system, as well as your endocrine system with some hormones. We'll talk about that later on. Now, smooth muscle, it contracts more like think about a snake eating food. Like if you ever seen like that bolus of food moving through a snake, one part contracts while the other part opens up, and one part contracts while the other part opens up. That is how smooth muscle contracts. You can also think of it like if you put a tennis ball into a sock, a tube sock, and you had to push that tennis ball through to the toe of the sock. That's how smooth muscle contracts, kind of in this wave, this peristalsis wave. All right, moving on into the nervous tissue. Now, this one might make you a little anxious, pun intended, but it's actually relatively straightforward. The nervous tissue is going to be divided into two different areas. One is the central nervous system. This consists of your brain and your spinal cord. So if you were to look in your brain and your spinal cord, you would see these types of cells. And then if you look in your peripheral nervous system, this is primarily going to be like nerves we'll talk about later on, sensory neurons in your skin outside of the brain and the spinal cord. Now you see a major player on both of them in kind of pink here. So you've got this guy and you got this guy. This will be the most common cell in your nervous system in general. It's called a neuron. And I just want you to remember that neurons are just signaling cells. Signaling cells, they're going to talk to different tissues and tell them what to do and when. But these neurons are like power lines. You know the power lines outside where they have a lot of extra help. They've got insulation on the outside. They've got support with those big electrical poles. They've got people to go and help them whenever they get damaged, right? So the neurons have a lot of helpers, just like a power line would need a lot of helpers. So we call these little helpers, kind of in this teal color, will be glial cells. Glial cells. Glial cells mean literally glue cells. So it looks like they're kind of glued to the neurons. That's why they called them glia. Now, the glial cells, there's several different types. There's 4 central nervous system glial cells, 2 in the peripheral nervous system. The first one right here is called microglia. Microglia just means tiny glue cells. Microglial cell. I'll just say microglia. And this is going to be like the Navy SEALs of your central nervous system. And if you ever had like a concussion before, maybe you hit your head really hard and it got inflamed and maybe you had some headaches and stuff, the microglia would act as basically white blood cells to go to that area, fight off any potential infections, help clean up the debris, etc. So microglia help to basically be the white blood cell of your central nervous system. These guys right here, kind of on top of the neurons along projection of axon, is called an oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocyte. Oligo means many. Dendrocyte literally means branched cell. And the oligodendrocyte, I remember, makes a wrapping of myelin around the tube that is the neuron's axon. So a lot of terms there. Neuron has an axon signaling branch that goes down, and the oligodendrocyte basically wraps this insulation layer around itself. Why are we doing that? Well, if you've ever seen any sort of cable, hopefully this one's not going to shock me, but here's a cable right here. And in this cable, do you see the wire on the cable? I'll bring it a little closer. You see the wire? Let me try this one more time. Here we go. You see the wire here? If you say yes, you're lying to me because the wire is actually on the inside of this. What you see is the insulation on the wire, right? Now, why do we insulate our wires? Why do we insulate our neurons? Well, because this insulation called myelin is going to help speed up the signal of the axon, and it's also going to protect it. Brilliant. So the oligodendrocytes protect and speed up that signal. Furthermore, we also have these guys called astrocytes. Astrocytes literally translates to star cell because they kind of look like stars, okay? So if you were a cell, you'd be an astrocyte. Try to use that pickup line. So these astrocytes, couple things here. They're going to support the neuron structurally, so they're holding them up, kind of like the electrical pole that's holding up the wire. But they're also going to form a barrier from blood to brain. Barrier from blood to brain. Have you ever heard of the blood-brain barrier? This is an extra barrier where the astrocytes will basically test what's in the blood and prevent bad things from getting into the brain. So imagine if you had some sort of like toxins in the blood And generally the blood goes everywhere, right? And if this is a toxin here, you don't want that toxin getting from blood to these neurons, because if your neurons die, you die. So these astrocytes will notice that and say, hey, you are not welcome here, and block them from getting through. Really, really beneficial thing. But it's also a bad thing because we have certain drugs that could actually help neural functioning for like Alzheimer's disease, and we're struggling to figure out how we can get the drug past the blood-brain barrier. It's a really difficult process. So that's an interesting clinical connection. Last but not least, in the central nervous system, we have these things called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells. Some people say ependymal cells. I don't really care. But look at these. These are kind of cuboidal cells, but they're not lining the outside or inside the body, so we don't consider them epithelial tissue. A lot of E's here. But they will secrete some fluid into ventricles in the central canal. You'll learn more about this in the nervous system. And they're going to secrete this thing called CSF. That's called cerebrospinal fluid. Think of it just as like the hydraulic system that holds your brain up. So your brain is actually floating in essentially like a water-based environment, and it prevents the force of gravity and friction on it. So it kind of lubricates the brain and the spinal cord, and it'll also provide some nourishment because, as we can see, the astrocytes are preventing some of the nutrients from getting out, so this CSF can sometimes help nourish the neurons as well. Brilliant. Okay, now we're into the peripheral nervous system, nerves and sensory neurons on the outside, motor neurons on the outside as well. Same exact concepts, we still got to insulate the neuron, but in this case we're insulating them with things called Schwann cells. Schwann cells, they're basically the oligodendrocytes of the peripheral nervous system, again, myelinating those long axons. And then we've also got these guys called satellite cells on the outsides. Satellite cells, we called them that because they're kind of wrapped around the cell body, just like satellites wrap around the Earth as they orbit. Kind of interesting. And they're kind of the do-it-all cell for the peripheral nervous system. They're going to help fight off infections. They're going to help support and nourish the neuron. So they're kind of the do-it-all of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, last but not least, connective tissue. This is usually the one that students get the most confused about, because I think of it like the anatomists were looking at all these tissue types, and then they just found a bunch of random cells and gels and stuff like that, and they were like, you know what, let's just stop at these three, and let's group everything else back into connective tissue. So I'm going to give you some helpful hints to help you remember it. First off, connective tissue is going to be made of three components: cells, fluids, or gels, whatever you want to say, and fibers. Cells, gels, and fibers. These are going to be the three components of any connective tissue. So if you look at any one, for example, you will see a cell, you will see some fibers, and then intermingled between it will be the gels. So we always say that the cells, okay, the cells will build the gels and the fibers. All right, and we call the gels and the fibers combined together the matrix. So basically the cells build the matrix. Brilliant. So the thing is the connective tissue is going to be distinguished based on what cells are present as well as what fibers are present. So the three fiber types we're going to see are either collagen fibers, so this is going to be collagen in red. We may also see elastic fibers in blue. And we may see another type called reticular fibers in black. Okay, so collagen, really tough, strong protein. Elastic is going to obviously be kind of bendy. And then reticular is just like scaffolding. So it keeps a strong structure of scaffolding. So let's look through connective tissue. First, the proper connective tissue is going to be the connective tissue that makes sense. It looks like it's connecting things, binding things, but then there's going to be kind of other connective tissue here on the bottom. So I'm going to separate that out really distinguishedly, kind of in this blue and red. And this is going to be technically improper connective tissue on the bottom. So let's first start with proper. Dense proper or loose proper. We're going to divide it out into two categories. So we got loose over here, dense over here. Two main types of dense. Let's start with the first one. Do you notice dense connective tissue primarily has collagen fibers? Yes? Dense, going to have collagen fibers primarily. And we can have one that looks like this or like this. You kind of see how this is all intermingled and then this one's kind of smooth and in one way. We call it dense irregular for this one and then dense regular for this one because the fibers are regular versus irregular. Now, dense irregular, we got tough collagen fibers that were produced by these cells called fibroblasts. Fibroblasts, literally translating to fiber-building cells. So, fiber-building cells produce the collagen in a lot of interspersed matrix. This makes the connective tissue tough and kind of hold together. This is actually found in the dermis of your skin, underneath your epidermis. So, this is actually dense, irregular connective tissue underneath the stratified squamous cells. So that makes your skin really stretchy slightly. It's stretchy, but it's not going to like over elastic, right? You're not like Elastic Woman with your skin. But what it will do, it will keep it tough and connected to the structures below. You see that? So that is why it's irregular. It's kind of allowed to pull, but it's also going to stay strong. However, we've got dense regular, and this is actually found in tendons and ligaments. Tendons and ligaments. Let me ask you this. Do you want your tendons and ligaments to stretch? You do not want them to stretch. If they stretch, they'll actually rip. But they're really, really strong in one direction. In fact, your calf muscle, for example, is connected to your Achilles tendon that can withstand about 3,000 pounds of force per square inch. It's really strong in one direction. So I'm going to write that. Strong in one direction. It's good at holding bones and muscles kind of tight, depending on if it's a tendon or ligament. Now, you'll also sometimes have dense regular, but you'll also have some elastic tissue in here too, running alongside the collagen fibers. These are found primarily in the walls of your arteries because arteries need to be able to snap open and then snap shut as the blood is pushing through them. Okay, we'll learn more about that in A&P 2. All right, so that would be considered dense, regular, elastic connective tissue. So dense, regular, elastic. Brilliant. Okay, coming over to the loose. 3 main types. The first one is the classic connective tissue, binding virtually all of your organs. You'll find it if you're doing dissection all over the place. And this is called areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue. Once again, we've got our fibroblasts in there, and you see 2 main fiber types. You've got the collagen fibers, and then you've got a little bit of elastic fibers, and a lot of extra fluid matrix, okay? So this is able to kind of stretch and pull, but it's going to stay relatively rigid. Not as rigid as, say, dense irregular, but relatively decent. So this is widespread throughout a lot of organs. It binds a lot of organs together, keeps them tight. Next up, we've got reticular connective tissue. Reticular. And we can see why, because it's got those reticular fibers here. This is common in all of your lymphatic tissue. Lymphatic tissue like your spleen, like your bone marrow, like your lymph nodes. And the reason we have that is because it's like scaffolding, once again. It's kind of holding things up so that we can house a lot of cell types called lymphocytes. These are your white blood cells in your lymphatic system, and anytime there's, say, an infection in your lymph nodes, these lymphocytes can move through the reticulated areas of the connective tissue really easily to get to those pathogens and bacteria, that type of stuff. So that's why we use reticular connective tissue. Then you've got these fat ones, literally translating to adipocytes or adipocytes. That literally translates to fat cell, and the only goal of adipocytes is to store fat, adipose tissue. This is found around organs. It's found actually protecting the coronary arteries of your heart. It's annoyingly found subcutaneously right here for some of us. And so it's basically just storing fat both for insulation, protection, energy storage. Brilliant. Now, lastly, we've got these weird connective tissue types. We'll start right to left, kind of reading the Hebrew style, if you get that reference. This is bone tissue on the right. Now, why is this all going to be like not regular, like normal connective tissue? Why is this not called proper? Well, because you can see in proper, you get the cells, fibers, and gels surrounding. It's really easy. With all these, it's kind of hard to tell. They're a little different in their shape and function. So with bone, we've got cells called osteocytes, blasts and osteoclasts inside of themselves, building and breaking down the bone. So I'll write one of them down, osteocytes, translating to bone cell. But again, what's the gel of bone? Well, the gel of bone is actually a hardened, calcified substance called hydroxyapatite. It doesn't really fall into the nice, beautiful blend of fluids and gels, but it also has some collagen fibers inside of it. You just don't really see them. So that's why it's not really proper connective tissue. But obviously, it's going to support you, provide calcium storage, and help you move. Moving forward, we've got cartilages. So all three of these are going to be some form of cartilage. And I like to think of cartilage as kind of like a varying form of plastic. You know how plastic can be kind of like really stretchy, or it can be pretty hard, like in some totes and bins. So same thing with your cartilage. We've got the first main type here called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. And you see here we've got cells in all the cartilage called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes, translating to cartilage cells. And with hyaline cartilage, the matrix is a really hard plastic type. So I'm just going to write hard plastic for hyaline cartilage. Hard plastic. This is found, for example, in your rib cage. It's found like where your ribs connect to the sternum through those hyaline cartilage. You also have it wrapped around your trachea, keeping it strong and protected, but a little bit flexible, right? Your ribs can bend a little bit, your trachea can bend a little bit, but it's a really hard plastic protection. The next one you see here is going to be elastic cartilage. So I'll write elastic cartilage because it has the elastic fibers. This is found in the ears, your ears and your epiglottis. So your ears are very elastic. Look at this, it can bend like crazy. So that's why it's elastic, and your epiglottis actually covers your trachea inside. It can move up and down. It's really floppy, okay? So it's elastic cartilage. You can kind of bend back and forth, but it's still relatively rigid. Last one here is going to be fibrocartilage. Now with fibrocartilage, what's interesting here is fibrocartilage is really good at padding. So I'm going to write fibrocartilage first, fibrocartilage. So you've still got the chondrocyte, but you got this collagen fibers on the inside, and this allows for really good padding. I think of this as like a Tempur-Pedic mattress. It's pretty firm, but it's supportive and soft at the same time. So this is actually found in the meniscus of your knee. All of your weight is going down onto that meniscus, but it's made for the padding. It's found in between your vertebrae called your intervertebral discs, so that when you jump and all your vertebrae come together, there's padding in between, that fibrocartilage pad, okay? So it's really good for padding. Brilliant. Let's move to the left. We've got blood. As you can see here, we've got red blood cells. We've got white blood cells. So red blood cells here, white blood cells here. But what's the fibers in the fluids, right? I thought connective tissue had cells, gels, and fibers. Well, inside of the blood, we're going to have random small proteins that you can't necessarily see. And you're also going to obviously have fluid interspersed all the way throughout called your plasma. So the plasma is found in between your cells. It's like the fluid of your blood. And you may have heard of donating your plasma before. So the plasma is the fluid part of your blood. You've got some proteins floating around, and you've got the cells. So it makes this sort of colloid mixture. It's like a mixture that you can't really see through. It's thick, viscous, and there's just a lot of stuff packed into it. So that's blood, and that's all connective tissue, but I wanted to come back finally to epithelial tissue. I did not say one type of epithelial tissue, so I just wanted to put it on your radar. This last one is called transitional epithelium. And you can see why. It can kind of bend and stretch because it's found in your bladder, as well as your ureters and your urethra ever so slightly, not necessarily much in your urethra. But this allows it to stretch and then contract backwards when the muscular tissue compresses it. But it's still lining your body. Like if you stuck, hypothetically, like a catheter up your urethra, you'd be touching epithelial tissue inside the bladder, but it's able to stretch and compress in the transitional. That's the one thing that doesn't really fall under the nice category of shape and layer. So hopefully this is helpful. This is a lot of tissue. As you go through the rest of the course, you're going to see them come up a lot. For example, in chapter 5 for my class, you're going to see skin. You're going to see epithelial tissue. You're going to see dense irregular. Right underneath it, you're going to see adipose tissue. So just think of these as different parts of the big mosaic that is your body. So thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if this was helpful, and have a great day.